Welcome to our panel on Ganzfeld ESP research. We're going to have 4 presentations from researchers, old and new, who are all actively involved in Ganzfeld research. And my job is going to introduce you to what the Ganzfeld is and why I think it's of value. First of all, to say something about where I'm coming from. This is the University of Edinburgh Psychology Department, where the Koestler Parapsychology Unit is based. Here's a picture from around about 1990 of Bob Morris, who was the leader of our unit. On this picture you also see Richard Wiseman, whose name will come up later in connection with Ganzfeld research, and also Chuck Honorton, very important in Ganzfeld research. And there's a young me as well. So that's just to tell you a little bit about where we're coming from. And some of the work that we've done at Edinburgh has of course been involved with testing the psi hypothesis using the Ganzfeld method. So for those of you who are not familiar with this method, it's a mild sensory isolation procedure where the participant relaxes. They wear headphones to present a kind of white noise, which would sound like a kind of waterfall. They have red light shining in their eyes, and they relax and basically give an ongoing verbal report called the mentation of the impressions that are coming to their mind. And in a typical telepathy study, in another room, somebody else is acting as a sender and is looking at a target. It might be an art print or, for example, a randomly chosen video clip, and trying mentally to communicate that to the person who's acting as receiver in the Ganzfeld. And in these studies, the results are usually summarized in the form of hit rate, so how often can you correctly identify the target from the mentation, the description that the receiver is giving. Now, this method's been going around for a long time, starting in the 1970s, and the first batch of studies were analysed by these two individuals, Ray Hyman on the left and Chuck Honorton on the right. And they came up with similar results in terms of the success rate overall, where chance would be 25%. They both found over chance results, but they differed in how they interpreted these, with Hyman, the skeptic, saying he thought that there were errors in these early studies that would inflate the results, and Honorton saying he thought that there was enough here to suggest a step towards a replicable psi effect. And they then went on and did something very constructive, which is publish recommendations jointly on what they did agree for future Ganzfeld research. So this involved making some recommendations on the actual methodology of the session, also about pre-specifying the size of the study, whether it was formal or informal, and using a technique called meta-analysis as a way of evaluating and combining groups of studies. And this, at the time in 1986, was quite pioneering. In fact, Robert Rosenthal, the methodologist, commented on the value of the Ganzfeld debate. He said, replicability is a central problem in parapsychology and also in many sciences. Not only parapsychologists, but scientists in general owe a great debt of gratitude to Hyman and Honorton. Since then, there have been 2 landmark meta-analyses of the Ganzfeld database, and the first was published by Julie Milton and Richard Wiseman, and the second by Lance Storm here, photographed at Tressoldi and De Riccio. And they're landmark because they're published in the Psychological Bulletin, which is a leading psychology journal. And so I want to give you a picture now of what that database looks like, and that essentially represents the studies that have had the benefit of the methodological recommendations made by Hyman and Honorton. So this graph shows you the horizontal line there at 25 is basically showing you the chance result. And first of all, I'm going to bring in those studies that are in these 2 meta-analyses that came from Edinburgh, from our researchers, and we found an overall significant effect of 31% hit rate, where, as I said, 25% is chance. However, of course, you would not just rely on a single laboratory to try to judge whether or not you have replicable evidence for ESP. And if we bring in the rest of the studies, then again, we find a very similar hit rate. So much wider range of researchers here, and overall a 30% success rate. Despite that, there is still debate over whether or not these studies represent replicable evidence for ESP. And the arguments tend to fall into two camps. Those who are in the yes camp would argue that, for example, that database represents the work of many different experimenters, so it's not just all on one person's shoulders. Secondly, there is evidence from the meta-analyses that there's no relationship between the quality of the methodology and the results. So it's not the case that those studies that are coming up with positive results tend to be poorer quality methodology studies. And thirdly, there are some interesting internal patterns, and perhaps Abby will speak a bit more about these, to do with better results with selected participants compared to studies with unselected participants. And you might not expect that if we were just looking at publication bias or random positive results. Counter-arguments that have been put forward, one by the likes of Jim Alcock, a skeptic, saying that ESP is just impossible, therefore there must be something wrong with these studies. That's not a particularly scientific position. But there have been more systematic critiques, for example, by our very own Dick Bierman, suggesting that because we do know that questionable research practices are found in other areas, they're probably also found in parapsychology, and if you model these, you find that it's likely that the effect size is somewhat inflated by these QRPs. We're lucky now that we have tools to deal with this, or to start to deal with it, this question of questionable research practices. So we have now, thanks to the internet, study registries which will help to solve that problem. And of course, as you know, one of them is run by the Koestler Parapsychology Unit. So to sum up, why do I think that the Ganzfeld method is valuable? One is that the method itself, it maps onto psychic experiences. So this sensory isolation procedure that's used might look a bit weird, but it's trying to lull the participant into a sort of sleep-like state that resembles what spontaneous cases like Louisa Rhine's surveys have shown. A tendency for these cases to occur when the participant is particularly relaxed or in a sleep-related state. Secondly, these studies go back into the mid-1970s, and we can learn lessons from that volume of effort. As I said, there are some signs of internal patterns in this work. These studies have sort of clues, if you like, for how to boost future studies by, for example, doing studies with selected participants that might improve the effect size. And finally, as we've seen with the debate and Robert Rosenthal's comments, this whole question of how to do good quality research and how to do replicable research is enlightening, not just for parapsychology, but for science more broadly. And just to finish, I will hand you over now to our next speaker, Abby Pulley. Abby is a PhD student at Edinburgh, and she is under my supervision. She's going to talk about her research towards a golden standard experiment. Over to you, Abby.
Thank you, Caroline. As you said, I'm talking about creating a golden standard telepathy Ganzfeld study. A brief overview. The main issues facing designing such a study are some are very in particular to the Ganzfeld study, whilst others relate to wider issues in psychological research in general. But the primary concern for this study is to combine as many methodological, statistical, and study design recommendations as feasibly possible. But I will start with a brief introduction about what we mean by a golden standard and the justification for doing such a study. As I briefly stated, we're trying to combine as many recommendations as possible to create a methodologically and statistically sound Ganzfeld study, hence making it the golden standard. But you might be thinking, oh, we're flogging a dead horse, it's another Ganzfeld telepathy study, so why are we doing it? The Ganzfeld literature consistently shows overall success, greater than chance, as mentioned by Caroline, especially when we use selected participants, so those who are creative, believe in Psi or have past experiences of Psi events and practice a mental discipline such as yoga, and the studies that follow standard protocol are most likely to have overall success. This was found by Storm and colleagues in 2010, and most recently they found a similar effect in 2020. However, there remains criticism. So Bierman and colleagues argued that there are questionable research practices. So this includes optimal stopping of studies and optional extension of studies, which shows that the Ganzfeld literature is likely inflated by these questionable research practices. Again, Wagenmakers and his colleagues in 2011 criticized Bem's Feeling the Future study series, quite famously, due to the use of exploratory data analysis and one-sided p-values which overstate evidence against the null. And these aren't issues that are just issues for parapsychology, but also for wider psychology and since its replication crisis. And so Wagenmakers argues that to convince a skeptical audience of a controversial claim, such as psi, we need to conduct strictly confirmatory studies whilst using conservative statistical tests. So some methodological issues that are of major concern for running such a study. These go beyond just thinking of the usual fraud, which is the primary question when assessing such a Ganzfeld study. Things we can do to alleviate blatant fraud is duplicate randomization of duplicates of the randomization process and the results to areas such as remote servers that the experimental team cannot access during data collection. Experimenters should observe one another and they should switch roles during the study series so they're not finding flaws in the system that they can manipulate and tweak data. Again, sensory leakage is quite particular to the Ganzfeld, but the experimenter should always be with the receiver, and audio and visual shielding of targets as a baseline, but also electromagnetic shielding such as a Faraday cage to prevent radio and electronic communication, especially in the day of mobile phones. Issues that affect more wider psychology research as software validation. We often assume that when we're running studies that the software that we're using or we're making is doing what we think it should be doing. And so we should probably have an individual come in who didn't make the software, especially if it's one made in-house, to make sure there's no intentional or unintentional fraud before the data collection. And something Caroline briefly mentioned before about pre-registration of studies alongside with open access data, such as the Society of Psychical Research. It's becoming more commonplace in parapsychology, and psychology is slowly picking up, but these help alleviate systematic errors, such as not identifying confirmatory or exploratory hypotheses in advance of the data collection, and it allows researchers to be open to critique before the study commences, so these can be corrected. Statistical issues, again, reflects both psychological studies and parapsychological studies. Both power and null hypothesis statistical testing or frequentist statistics are most commonly used in psychology. However, there's a fundamental weakness in null hypothesis statistical testing, as its failure to reject the null hypothesis doesn't mean there is no effect. And p-values tend to overstate evidence against the null, and this is exacerbated as the sample size increases. So the larger the sample size you have, the more likely to find a significant outcome. And so we should be moving towards more Bayesian statistics, which are more conservative, but they also provide a certainty in our outcomes. Likewise with power, null hypothesis statistical testing doesn't provide you with an estimate of the difference from the null, which is a measure of effect size, even if there is a difference from zero. And again, a p-value less than 0.05 does not mean there is a large effect size, even if the p-value is very small. And so we should be using prospective power analysis with a defined effect size of interest, because if our study doesn't achieve this effect size of interest, then we're not interested in it. And so we need to determine our sample size in advance to ensure we're getting the power which is satisfactory. And finally, an issue that is very specific to this study is the sender-receiver relationship. I'm currently in the stage of preliminary analysis of the Ganzfeld telepathy data to post-joint communique. And this is to look at factors with this sender and receiver relationship that perhaps hasn't been analysed and addressed before, looking at the factors of interest listed below, and to see if any of these are significantly predicting study success. And if any of them are, we can include them into the study, and perhaps these are making the study more psi-conducive. If they are significant, then we can include them and we can control for them. And finally, the conclusions. You can probably come to the conclusion this is a multifaceted project with lots of things going on, lots of recommendations. And the idea is that this study could be a model experiment that others can adopt. Obviously, other experiments will use different participants and different selection procedures, but if we can get down the core areas of this study controlled and measured and defined, and people can access this via open access data, then other labs can use it too. However, there are still some questions to consider. You'll have heard the phrase is golden. So the golden standard will be different for other researchers in the field. My definition of a golden standard telepathy study will be different to someone else. Selected participants, what do we mean by them? They can be selected in different ways, different characteristics, which I'm sure will be discussed throughout this debate. And finally, the standard Ganzfeld. This remains an ambiguous definition. There is still no one single definition of the standard protocol of the Ganzfeld, and this has been highlighted since 1999 with Milton's database. And this is perhaps something to think about with the next presentation by Alexander, who is using a new technique in the Ganzfeld, and I will let him take over.
Thank you, Abby, for this introduction. So my name is Alexandre Batissou, and I'm a PhD student under the supervision of Professor Thomas Rabéron. In this talk, I will speak about one of my PhD research currently conducted at the University of Rouen in France. So the title of this presentation is Improving Ganzfeld with Virtual Reality as Problem. But before explaining in more detail why we chose this title and the associated study, I would like to briefly present the background of what we know so far about the Ganzfeld. Hundreds of experiments have been performed since the 1980s, typically using ping-pong ball, homogeneous ray light, and white noise. The results of the studies show that Ganzfeld experiments are more successful when the targets are video clips. With time and advancing technology, the protocols have become more sophisticated and the scores higher. With Professor Rabéron, we wondered if it was possible to improve the Ganzfeld, and this is what brings us to talk about our study, which will take place in the fall. We are going to set up a precognitive Ganzfeld because there are no clear difference between the telepathic Ganzfeld and precognitive Ganzfeld. The precognitive Ganzfeld is better from a methodological point of view. Some objective of this research is to include the latest technological advances in a precognitive Ganzfeld study. For this, we will use a stroboscopic device and a virtual reality helmet. The lamp will aim to induce a deeper altered state of consciousness than a classical Ganzfeld, at least we hope so, and to improve psi perception through an immersive visual experience. The altered state of consciousness will be induced with a stroboscopic device called the Lucia number 3. It was developed by a neurologist and a clinical psychologist. Their objective was to simulate a near-death experience in order to reproduce the generally beneficial properties of this type of experience for therapy. The lamp is composed of a central halogen and 8 LEDs controlled by a computer. Schwartzman and Bartosek carried out 2 interesting studies showing that the Lucia number 3 could mimic certain aspects of psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin. And because it's a precognitive Ganzfeld, the target will be displayed inside the virtual reality helmet. And for this, we are going to use the Oculus Quest 2, which is a very good compromise because of its ease of use, its lightness, and the performances it can offer for video games. The parameters of this study are the following. 100 participants will be recruited. Since we have a strobe device, the screening of the participant for epilepsy and photosensitivity will be done with questionnaires. Furthermore, to optimize our results, we will also make a selection of participants using the revised transluminity scale and other scales about exceptional experiences. Each participant of our study will pass under the strobe device with bright noise diffusing in the headset for 15 minutes. The flicker frequency is set on 10 Hz so that the participant can enter an alpha state through a brainwave entrainment. We have chosen this frequency according to the existing literature on photic stimulation, as well as with some pre-tests performed with few students. Each participant will be able to speak freely during the stimulation under the lamp, and a small debriefing of the session will take place. This will allow to recover additional material of what he will have perceived during the stimulation and which would have escaped him. Concerning our games, we will have 4 pools of 4 games. Inside each pool, the games will be very different from each other, going from ping pong to shooting games. This will allow an increased recognition of the game for the judge according to the mentation of the participant. To make the experience even more immersive, we will use an haptic vest that converts the sound inside the game into vibration on the body. The course of the study is done according to these steps. First of all, we generate an altered state of consciousness under the lamp while recording the participant mentation during the stimulation. Once the stimulation is finished, we proceed to a debriefing, and the audio is then automatically labeled with participant number, date and time, and sent on a server. Using the MATLAB software and the USB key, we launch the random number generator to designate a pool and the game within the pool. Then, we make the participant play in virtual reality. Once all participants have taken part of the experience, the judge gets back the audio from the server and the spreadsheet mentioning only the pool of games drawn by the RNG. It will have to recognize which game corresponds to the participant's mentation. With Professor Raberon, we have planned other studies. One of them would be to improve altered state of consciousness using a dry flotation tank. And the other one would study correlation between sight perception and EEG analysis when the participant is under the lamp. Another study for my PhD research is programmed for January 2022. It will consist in inducing an altered state of consciousness with the strobe device in order to potentializing the images of exceptional experiences. The main goal is to identify the neurobiological signatures of participants living such an experience. We also would like to thank the Trinity College of Cambridge, through which we obtained a per-query grant and which allows us to finance the study and the Ganzfeld. Thank you for listening, and now I'll let the next speaker make his presentation, Professor Chris Rowe.
I think all of the panel members are basically arguing for the continued relevance of the Ganzfeld technique as a means of testing for psi in the laboratory. Notwithstanding a recent issue in the Journal of Parapsychology, I think it's fair to say that the Ganzfeld has fallen out of favor with many researchers, though to paraphrase Mark Twain, rumors of its death are exaggerated. I'd like to use my time today to talk a little bit about the Ganzfeld research that I've been involved with and thus far, and my plans for the future, in the hope that it encourages others to think again about the Ganzfeld as a viable and valuable method, especially if they pre-register their studies. You will recognize the first picture again. Like Caroline, my PhD was supervised by Bob Morris as a member of the Koestler Parapsychology Unit. I explored a psychological analysis of interactions with pseudopsychics, specifically cold reading, but there was lots of scope at that time to get involved in other projects. This was an exciting time with Chuck Honorton coming over to join the unit to build an auto-Ganzfeld system that might allow independent replication of the highly significant experiments that he'd conducted at PRL that Caroline mentioned already. Rick Berger and Dean Radin also came to visit later on when Chuck sadly died before the setup was complete. This was the early 90s and IT was still very slow and cumbersome, and there were various technical challenges in randomizing and accessing target material, which was still held on VHS tapes. But when the setup was complete, there were opportunities for unit members to book time and run their own experiments, as well as the formal pre-planned experiments. I used that time as an opportunity for personal professional development. That included lots of teaching, but also getting involved in as many research projects as possible. And I collaborated with some other PhD candidates, Tony Lawrence, Carl Williams, and Ian Upchurch, on a Ganzfeld experiment that was designed to focus on the role of the experimenter. We were a 4-person team who took turns to take the role of experimenter, receiver, or sender. For each trial, the 2 who were designated senders would participate in the initial rapport building meeting and then withdraw to the sender's room. There, the computer would decide randomly whether this trial required 0, 1, or 2 senders. And if one or both of us were unneeded as senders, we'd go back to our office and work on other things. Seeing the chart that Caroline showed before, this experiment still is close to having the largest psi missing effect in the database thus far, perhaps for psychosocial reasons that are explained in the paper that we produced in 1994. but it was a very valuable learning experience and convinced me that this was an approach that I wanted to continue with. One reason was that there was a theoretical underpinning to the approach in terms of Honorton's noise reduction model, which was an attempt to identify commonalities in reported conditions that were believed to be psych-inducive. It focused on the notion that psi could be a ubiquitous channel of information, but that it was often overwhelmed by other sources of psychological and physiological noise. In some ways, it was an extension of Aldous Huxley's reducing valve model, and this is having something of a revival in a new, more sophisticated form with Jim Carpenter's first sight model. Additionally, the Ganzfeld seemed to better reflect the circumstances under which ordinary people reported spontaneous experiences of ESP. They typically reported that at the time, they were in a mild altered state of consciousness, such as drifting off to sleep, or passively engaged in some undemanding task that allowed their mind to drift in an unfocused kind of way. So this clearly seemed to be an important feature that we needed to incorporate into experimental tests. I left Edinburgh to take up a position at the University of Northampton and was fortunate to have ready access to a perception lab and then to secure funds that allowed us to build a bespoke automated system for linking an experimenter's control suite to sender and receiver rooms. We developed our own pool of digitized video clips, since the Edinburgh clips were mainly drawn from those that Honorton had brought with him, and they were looking very dated by this point. Our early experiments involved sender-receiver pairings, and we wanted to ensure that the material was engaging for the novice sender. So we took advantage of cultural icons that might evoke some kinds of common associations. For example, we included Clint Eastwood in a spaghetti western, Arnold Schwarzenegger as Terminator, and so on. For later studies, we switched to more immersive approaches, sounding a little bit more like the VR techniques that are currently popular. We were using remote viewing protocols with target locations that the sender visited. But when the locations nearby turned out not to be especially thrilling or thematically distinct, we switched to targets that could be presented using Google Earth. This allowed us to use locations such as the one here, St. Peter's Square in Rome, as a location. And we adopted a precognitive design so that the person had to connect with the experience that they themselves would have in the future. This worked much better in having the retrospective sending more clearly focused on the target and to its connections with the Ganzfeld mentation, since that was already in the past. It also avoided the potential artifact of having receivers exposed to the 3 decoy images during the judging procedure, which we believe causes some kinds of problems for people. And then these studies are usually evaluated by independent judges. So how have things worked out at Northampton? Here's a comprehensive table that outlines the work that we've completed to date. I've listed the Edinburgh study for completeness, but not included it in the summary statistics. And speaking of which, I'd like to thank Lance Storm and Patricio Tressoldi for allowing me to use their direct hits effect size calculations that they've produced for the updated meta-analysis that they're currently working on. From the table, it may seem as if there's a hiatus between 2007 and 2020, but in fact, those 3 studies we reported in 2020 had been reported separately at PA conventions in 2010, 2012, and 2015. You can see that we've mainly focused on telepathy designs where people bring their own sender. Even the 2 studies that include a no sender condition would still include somebody that they brought with them and then will be asked to complete some other task. Since the 2005 study, we've conducted a number of Dream ESP experiments and had developed a preference for precognitive designs, and it had worked very well there. And it seemed to make sense to adopt that for our later Ganzfeld work, hence the switch from the T's, the telepathy studies, to the P's in those later studies. Now, clearly, in terms of outcome, there's some variation. And in particular, the later, more immersive studies have been the most successful. The cumulative record is independently significant with a hit rate of 32.7%, and that's somewhat lower than Honorton's PRL database, which was at 34.4, but slightly higher than Storm, Tressoldi, and Dirisio's summary of those studies that were conducted between 1987 and 2008. That was 32.2%. Thinking about Abby's presentation, we also looked at process factors. So we're based in a psychology department and have been particularly interested in personality and individual differences factors and how they might predict Ganzfeld performance. Initially, we took our lead from Honorton's 1997 recipe for success, but we've branched out as other dimensions started to look more promising. X's on the table indicate that no relationship was detected when we used that measure, and ticks indicate significant relationships. it's clear that there's been little encouragement from our findings to persist with particular measures, though ironically, failing to persevere with measures might actually lead to the non-significant picture overall here, since each individual study is of relatively low power. I'd be happy to talk later on about why we don't run experiments with 100 sessions during questions. And in fact, it's come up in a couple of the other talks as well. So that gives you an idea of where we've been, where we are now, and this is where we shall be going. Current activity has, of course, been seriously impacted by the COVID pandemic, and research on campus has been completely suspended for the last 18 months. It's unlikely to return to normal until the new academic year in September. We have 2 projects on the slate, one of which will begin data collection in the autumn. And this is an experiment kindly funded by the BL Foundation, with my colleagues doing David Saunders here and Hayley Barton in the top slide, part of the slide. And this is testing Jerzy Wackerman's assertion that the Ganzfeld stimulation technique does not induce a hypnagogic-like state. Based on the EEG data, he contends that it doesn't. A lot of us think, well, the fact that some people actually pass through a state and end up falling fast asleep kind of implies that at least for some people, it can work in that way. And we want to test it further using the kind of EEG equipment that's available today, which is much less intrusive for people to wear, and I think much more sensitive as well. So our receivers will wear wireless EEG headsets during a standard Ganzfeld induction, and we'll test to see whether they experience a physiological shift and whether this is related to the outcome on the ESP task. On the second part of the slide, we have an ongoing collaboration that sadly was not funded by the BL Foundation, and this is with Adam Rock and Glenn Hitchman, that will address the common belief that, again, we've heard during the panel, expressed by many people in various academic discussion lists, that participants should be pre-selected in some way, although the criteria that people propose tend to vary from situation to situation. We're working currently on a meta-analysis of studies that include personality and individual differences measures to see if they'd produce effects that are large and robust enough for them to provide a basis for that kind of pre-selection. We hope to be able to report on both of these at next year's convention, and we hope to see you there. I hope I've just about managed to stay in time. That brings me to the end of the panel. Thank you for your attention to all 4 presentations. Let's open it up for questions.